Welcome to Navigate Now. This is the podcast where we talk about every people and places related. I'm your host, Jon Docksey, and I'm super looking forward to today's guest. We're talking about counting people and shaping places. So, thanks very much for being part of this episode. But before we start the conversation, Mark, it'd be fantastic to learn a little bit about you. Thanks for joining us on this episode. But what's your journey? Well, tell me a bit about introduction to yourself.
Well, you can probably guess from the accent I'm a Kiwi. So I've born and bred in New Zealand, in the very deep south of New Zealand. In fact, think Lord of the Rings, and you kind of know where I grew up.
Nice.
Always sort of worked with data in different forms and across different sectors. So I've worked in retail, banking, TV, photography, more recently in renewables and mobile technology, and now in Footfall. But data has been the kind of core to all of that. And I love exploring data and how people can use it and the kind of the insights you can draw out of it.
Love it. That's a broad journey. Is it? Obviously, you're based in the UK now. Any other countries in between here and New Zealand, or is it mostly those two?
Living wise, just these two. I have had the opportunity to kind of explore the world, so I have seen upwards of about 30 different countries, and
Wow.
In previous roles had opportunities to kind of go there for work, done a lot on pleasure as well. So yeah, there's lots of beautiful places out there.
100%. The world is like, we're here to talk about people and places, right? And exactly. The world is the most amazing place that we have to explore. And we can unpick some of those bits and pieces, maybe UK or other countries, in this particular conversation around counting people and shaping places. So before we crack on, we always say, let's get to know the person behind the voice. So anything interesting to know about Mark?
Well, I actually started studying art at Nelson Marlborough Institute of Technology. And while there, I learned to eat fire. It was part of a bit of a, it was kind of challenge those sort of things that you grow up thinking about, don't touch fire, it's hot and that sort of stuff. And it was about saying, actually, if you know how to manage some of those things, you can actually counter your fears. And it's it was quite an experience. I can still do it. I don't like doing it because it's kind of kerosene and it gets into your inside. It doesn't taste nice, but it's an impressive party trick.
That is the most impressive party trick on this podcast, period. So no, I'm not going to ask you to demonstrate it. So don't worry about the bottle of kerosene just beside you or whatever. But no, that's really good, and that's really interesting to understand. So as I said, super looking forward to having this conversation. But maybe just kind of like to start off with, I'm thinking about kind of data is great, data is vast, and data is huge, etc., etc. But how does data shape decisions that town centres and districts are not aware of? And I kind of was thinking about this and referring it to could we refer to data as finding out what's invisible? I guess decisions are often made from instinct or opinions, conversations, the old adage of getting a team together and essentially your design will be just a boring camel by the end of it. But how does data bring clarity, maybe confidence, and how do we then share that in an objective and understanding way? That might be a big question. So kind of where does data bring clarity to those kind of conversations in your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really is the crux of how people can use data. I mean, data on its own, there's so many different data points you can pull into any discussion. So I think that for me, it's always about asking the right question up front and wanting to know what you want to explore as the kind of hypothesis in this. Because if you know the question you want to ask, then you can ask it of the data and it will come back to you. Data is great at providing the evidence. So, for example, if you say, look, the street is busy, it looks busy, lots of people on it, that's all very good. But if you can sort of say, oh, actually, there's 1,000 people come down the street in the last hour, they've got a data point that you can prove, you can measure against, you can evidence against, you can use as an insight that can be taken forward. Yeah. So, just to sum that up, it is about asking the right question of the data, because you can find out anything from the data, But it's if you know what you're looking for and you've got that as an insight, something you can measure, something you can compare against, that becomes really powerful, and that becomes it's a fact. It's a concrete fact that you can use as a basis to make those decisions rather than just relying on your gut, as you sort of mentioned.
Do you see data then coming into that? Say, I'm thinking about this meeting that's going on, that we're discussing this scenario in that sense. Do you see data getting to helping decision make quicker, or just more informed, or add a richer layer information to the conversation?
I don't know if it becomes quicker, because the nature of capturing the data can take time. So if you're coming from a point where you have no data but you want to find it, then obviously there's a plan, a project in place to kind of get that data. And then there's questions to say, well, is it a long enough period of time, and all those sorts of things. I guess in my experience, most things, most decisions are made emotionally, then backed up rationally. And to a lot of extent, a lot of this stuff, particularly from a local council point of view, it can be an emotional decision that's then back, that you then got the data to come back it up or challenge it. Now, does that mean it's going to be a quicker decision? Well, probably isn't, because it's not not a quick one, but it is a more evidence-based decision. You've got that proof to kind of say, this has happened. We can see it happening. We can see, if we make the change, what that change has, the impact of that change has been. Can we see more? Keep watching in the data. So I think it's making more informed decisions is probably the best way to look at it.
Yeah, and more informed, I guess. There's various different data types that we can use. Would you know more than me in that sense? But would the bigger data points be like footfall is the big one that people come across, or card spend, so money spent on debit, credit cards, etc. If they're the top two, are they? What would be the next other data points that you would want to make people aware of that maybe don't come up into a typical request or a typical conversation?
Great question. So your footfall and spend is definitely the two top ones. Whenever I'm speaking with bids or town centres, footfall is the big topic they're looking at. And then spend is probably more from a retail point of view, but it's a flavour. It flows in as part of the discussion. Obviously, to be successful, you want to have more spend and the like.
Yeah.
Outside of that, there is a number of other data points that we tend to look at. What we've been working on is some of the sort of smarter data, which takes things like socioeconomic bands, household composition, origin, so where people have actually come from. And you can take that sort of data from mobile apps, from phone, from different sort of data sets like that, which can enhance your understanding of who's actually coming into an environment. So it's no longer just an individual; it's a person who's come in who prefers to go to a particular coffee shop, might go shop in a supermarket, which you can track through breadcrumbs. You know what their spend is, you know what their household composition is. You've got a real understanding of what's going on. And I see this for a lot of town centres looking when they're doing regeneration projects. They are looking to say, well, what's happening? Has the actual population changed for coming in here? Has our efforts worked? So the extra data points are becoming more and more important, anchored by footfall, anchored by spend, but it's more flavour, more colour to the kind of the overall sort of picture.
I guess that fits in nicely with wayfinding, doesn't it? Because if we understand exactly where people's journey is, you can create the information that either enforces that or spreads that. A lot about wayfinding is about the flow and the spread of that journey. If we've got a pinch point in a particular crossroads or a junction, we can see that through data and then say, right, actually, these people end up over here. They could go this way instead. So it's beautiful how data can come together. And I like how you kind of intertwine various data points. They're the top level ones and the ones that people might not consider as often to be able to. Then my next, as I'm thinking about that, is we have that data. We have, like you say, footfall data, maybe behavior data. How does that then change decisions that you mentioned the town centre manager, the bid manager makes within their projects?
Yeah. So typically in any sort of marketing activity, you're going to look for an ideal customer profile. And what the discussions I have with the bid managers and town centre managers is to understand what is their ideal customer profile, who's coming into the area. They typically have the discussions with the retailers. So the retailers say, we would like these types of people coming in here. And that kind of feeds back. And what we can do with the data is say, well, what does the current customer profile look like versus what's the ideal customer profile look like? What we can then do is actually go and say, well, let's find some of those ideal customer profiles. Where do they actually live? And how do we get to them? How do we market to them? How can we actually attract them into the town centre? So it becomes almost a self-fulfilling sort of cycle where by looking at the data, understanding who's coming in there, you can influence it and change it and use it to focus your marketing efforts, focus your maybe the decisions you make on types of events you hold, and even the types of retailers that happen to be in the town centre. It's quite a it adds so much value to any sort of bid manager to be able to say, look, these are the types of people coming in here. This is the types of events we're doing to attract more of those types of people coming in here. Speaking to the retailers going, fantastic. Those are the right ones we want to have come in, and they're spending the money.
Cool, I love that. So kind of where this becomes really beneficial in the real world project management in that sense is, like as you said, events, the types of people that businesses, the operators of the particular place. The retail mix, I guess, is maybe a summary of describing that, and marketing, as you mentioned. Are there any other types of decisions where you're in conversations with place custodians, and what data can really help in this particular situation? Any safety and other aspects?
Yeah, I was just about to touch on that. It's a great, great minds. I mean, the footfall piece is a great, to sort of see the flow of footfall throughout the day, throughout the week. Peak times and weekends and at night, etc., helps the bid managers and town centres, coordinate their security, their cleaning efforts, so they can be operationally more efficient. They know when to be putting people out there. For example, if there's an event they've planned, they can kind of they know what's going to the size of the event potentially could be, because they know who they're talking to, who they're going to attract into that audience and into there, and they can really sort of scale up and say, right, we need this number of security staff and cleaning and that around that sort of piece. They also can inform the retailers again, so they can do this, get their staffing right. And it might even look at, if you're looking at the footfall flow and patterns in the footfall, it might even suggest changes to operating hours. Maybe it's a later night on a Tuesday night or a Thursday night. We're seeing things like the shopping, lunchtime shopping is moving, now to between 1 to 2 versus, previously at 12. More people are going out during the week because they're working from home. So they working from home and going out and shopping versus going out in the weekend. So all these sort of patterns you see can help, shape and make sure that, the retailers and the bids are operating efficiently and have got the right levels of staffing to support what's needed.
Yeah, that shows how critical data is, isn't it? And do you see projects bringing in this level of information earlier than they used to be more of a data-led project than a kind of it's a byproduct at the end? Sometimes kind of in wayfinding, we often have a conversation, particularly say, because we don't just work in town centres and city centres in that sense, but say like they're building a new building, wayfinding might be the last thing that is thought about. But generally, some of these elements of various professionals, and that's the reason of having various guests on this particular podcast, is seeing how we can educate and share knowledge that we can influence things a little bit earlier than we might do.
Yeah, and I share the same view. I mean, I've been working hard to try and get in front of emerging bids, so bids that are working on developing proposals before they even go to ballot. And then what we've tend to see is that a brand new bid, their primary focus is security and cleaning, because the retailers say, well, we want a better looking town centre. It tends to be in the second renewal, so not second, well, the first renewal of that bid. So after the first 5 years, they start to talk about footfall and say, well, we want more of these types of people coming through. And it's at that sort of point, we, particularly in sort of building that second bid document, they start to say, well, let's look at footfall, let's look at who's coming in here, let's look at where they're coming from and using that. Any time anyone starts to talk about footfall is a good time. because they are, the data for everything, whether it's footfall, whether it's banking, whatever sort of industry, and data is the kind of lifeblood of understanding what's actually happening. That's the kind of those nuggets of gold, or the kind of the actual insights you can pull through. So having that data is really important. The challenge sometimes for bids, and I understand it, is the kind of boards and the retailers. Their initial focus is, let's get our town looking good, and the people will come. The footfall then can track that, but using some of the smarter data, you can start to say, well, actually, we can predict who could be coming and where they could be coming from, and we can speed up that process. So, yeah, getting in earlier is always better, in my view.
I guess that kind of summarises our first little part, doesn't it? Kind of data making the invisible visible in that sense.
Exactly.
Yeah. The look and feel, the touchy-feely stuff is really important for us, but a place to see that visual impact. There's loads of other things that go under the ground that are integral to the success above the water in that sense. So maybe just thinking about that then. So you said kind of data is really critical. It's not necessarily a fast fix in that sense, because I guess we can't compare data until we've run the other year, the other element of comparison in that sense. But what do we need to do or have in place to be able to collect and have that data? Like, what is the backbone of a good infrastructure that's needed to collect, clean, use data? I guess it requires the right technology, the right discipline, the right process. What would be that? How do we build that backbone to get a really good data set, etc.?
Well, there's a couple of different ways. It really depends what technologies are in play. Absolute footfall, so where you've got accuracy of 99%, requires physical sensors in place, and traditionally these sensors actually will record both people and vehicles and the like. You can train that they're AI enabled, so you can train them to do anything basically you want to do. You can pick them up, they can pick up bicycles, push chairs, the like. But it is a physical infrastructure piece.
Yeah.
Now, the things like, if you're looking at some of the smarter data, and there's a couple of different technologies out there. So you could either do Wi-Fi sniffing, which sort of sniffs if you're walking past with your phone, it will sniff out the fact you've got a phone and where you're going to. Or you might be, there's if you've got any apps on your phone and it's a free app, guarantee you're probably given permission for it to be tracked, for yourself to be tracked. There's folks that kind of collate that data and then share that. Google's a great example. I'm not sure if they actually sell that stuff, but you can go there, you can see where you've been and all that sort of stuff on Google. So that technology doesn't actually require a lot of, that capture doesn't require a lot of technology. The Wi-Fi sniffing, sometimes you will have a little device that can kind of sniff that, or it is just basically almost a grab of that data. What we've found, though, is having a blended approach is probably best. Sure. The app data, this Wi-Fi data, that gives you the richer insights, but it's not as accurate. If you're looking at samples, it could be from 10% to 50% of the population walking past are being sampled. Whereas with the footfall centres, you're sampling 100%. So 100% of that sample. So we tend to look and say, let's look at footfall as the anchor. You've got an absolute number. There we can compare it and factor it against the sort of smarter data. So if we know our absolute number, we can factor it up and say, well, of those, this number of people that look like this and that sort of stuff. That's more directional. It's not absolute, but it's great for strategy. It's great for the marketing. It's great for business decisions. And the footfall, coming back to it, is great for the actual tracking and what's actually happening, so that if you have, for example, your event, you can say, right, I want to see who I want to attract, what they look like, and then you can see, have I actually done it? Have I got the numbers? What's the numbers coming past that footfall sensor? One quick thing, just on the app stuff and the Wi-Fi sniffing and the like, it does need to be GDPR compliance, so you can't have any personal identifiers in that data. And because of that, a lot of that, most of it is anonymized up to a month level, so it doesn't give the granularity. Whereas the footfall, because the faces are obscured, you don't get that the data's processed in the sensor. You've still got that granularity down to within a minute or whatever it may be. So that's why it is still important. It's important to have that kind of blended approach. You can't rely on just the app data to give you footfall because it's not accurate.
You have a blended approach.
The blended approach is best, whereas the footfall sensors won't give you origin and that sort of stuff. So having both working together gives you a really clear view of what is going on, who's coming in, where they're going to, what brands they like to visit, all those sort of stuff I talked about before, kind of understanding the actual people who are coming in there at a level that you're not going to say, well, I can identify an individual person, which is
correct.
Again, in our industry, we do not want to be doing that.
100%. It's important to keep that privacy at all times. So would you recommend then, and say you take a town centre, putting those assets, those kind of tracking devices, in every street, or would they particularly focus on certain areas?
I normally have a discussion with the bid managers or towns councils and say, like, what do you want to measure? And it comes back to the original question, or the original point I made about asking the right questions.
Yeah.
So say, what do you want to measure? We do, along with bids and town centres and outside areas, we also obviously do shopping centres and retailers. And those are easy because you've got a perimeter. You can put the cameras around all the doors.
And you go, that's
sorted, it's done. In a town centre, it's less, it's more challenging because you're going to have streets coming in and that sort of stuff. So it's not going to be, again, absolutely accurate, but it's going to give you a lot better information than what you currently, if you've got nothing in there at all, rather than someone standing on the street and counting people. So if it's kind of really, the more you put it in place, the better. The more streets you cover off, the better. But you're never going to have a full perimeter in reality. It's just not feasible.
Where do you start? Where do you stop? Yeah, definitely.
That's it, yeah. I mean, the nice thing with the smart data is if you've got a anchor point with the footfall sensor in there, what you do is you're geofencing an area around that town, around that high street, whatever it is. So every time a phone passes into that area, you've kind of got a little bit, and that's why I was saying you can kind of factor up based on an anchor of one footfall sensor. So you could get away with one or two footfall sensors and then geofence the rest of it. That would give you a good understanding of what's going on. Not absolutely accurate, but close enough for you to make the right sort of decisions on.
Cool. You mentioned kind of that blended data approach to kind of iron out the idiosyncrasies, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah.
So that's
exactly it.
Good data, isn't it?
That's exactly it. It's understanding the limitations of the data. In anything, the smaller the sample size, the more likely that sample size is not going to represent the total population. So you want to try and maximise that sample size, or make ways to kind of replicate it or minimise the kind of chances that that's not going to represent the whole population. So having it anchored against an absolute number is a great way of doing that.
As I was thinking about this, that's super. As I was thinking about this conversation, my mind was wandering into all sorts of data things that I was going to learn. So really looking for a really insightful conversation in this episode. But just one question that came to my mind is, data is overwhelming. Potentially. There's lots of data, lots of streams. We've discussed a whole bunch of opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. How do we as a place custodian consume that, understand that, analyze that in a focused way so we don't feel overwhelmed?
Yeah, and it's a great question. Any footfall provider will have a good reporting suite, and based over many years and working with many different customers and many town centres, we've all developed kind of a set of dashboards or what are the key kind of indicators to look at. So the starting point is to kind of talk to your footfall provider and they'll say, right, these are things that the best of class will do. They'll look at this. So that you've got some starting points to really say, okay, what should I look at? Of all the things I could look at, what should I look at to start with? But what you can then do is start to question that. So you can start to say, okay, build me a bespoke report that looks at this. What's happening on a Saturday morning at between 10 and 12 in this part of the high street? You can start to dig and dive and change that. So having a good understanding of what to be looking for, what the kind of KPIs that you want to keep an eye on via dashboard is important. but also then question and ask and use those questions and answers to kind of shape your thinking and say, well, what else could we be doing? You know, back to your point about the wayfiring. If we're finding there's a pinch point on a Saturday morning, in this corner because there's a market there, then could we actually move people around that? What else could we be doing? It's just having the information is better than not having information in any sense. Knowing,
100%.
being aware is good because then you can make decisions on that. If you don't know, then it's a hard place to make decisions from.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's really critical. And so I remember the first time I sent out like an email marketing thing, I would sit there and watch the numbers slowly increase. So that got me thinking about kind of this next point I wanted to just get your opinion on is how often should we look at the data? Obviously, you could probably look at it live and you could waste your whole life. With respect to the source of data and that kind of stuff. How often, how regularly should we be looking at the data?
I think it comes back down to the questions you want to ask and the kind of KPIs you're setting yourself from that. When you're looking at data, you've got to be aware that what you're comparing against, because it's not just a data point in time, you want to be making comparisons. So you could look at the data and say, how's this week doing compared to the same week last year?
Mm-hmm.
You could look at today compared to the same day last week. You could look at this hour compared to the last hour. There's so many things you can compare against. But what you've got to be thinking about is, what am I asking? What I'm looking for in that data? What I want to know? What's it going to tell me? Is knowing that the last hour was quieter than this hour going to benefit me in any sort of way? Because that's kind of it's going to happen that way. But understanding that kind of that peak throughout the day and going, right, well, actually we know that now the lunchtime peak's around about 1 o'clock. That's an interesting piece of information that I can then use. And that might come through a number of weeks just watching that peak. You might see a shift for which days become more important. So keep asking yourself the question and say, what do I want to know? And then factor in that into your kind of your time frame as to how often you look at the data. A lot of people will look at it daily just so they can see how yesterday was.
Yeah.
You can look and say, well, what's tomorrow going to look like? You can do that sort of stuff. You might look at the data and say, well, how were we last year? Same sort of time. Is it busy? What kind of happened around that sort of stuff? And that's some of the stuff we're working on, is trying to also feed more data points into the data you can see in the reporting suite to give you a sense of not only what happened yesterday, but what is going to happen today and tomorrow. Where are the best, what is the, what's happening, what events are happening, or what happened, the build up to Christmas or whatever it may be, maybe the build up to Easter. There's always something that you can kind of compare against. So I'd probably say think about your KPIs and use that to guide yourself. You could spend all day looking at data, but it's not going to change that much to do it because each person go past. Yeah. So I think it's a smart asking smart questions, basically.
So there's a lot there about kind of the patterns that we can learn from data, like you say, analyze it across last week, last month, last year, etc., etc. I guess the real insightful information, as we've been chatting in this episode about, is understanding the people, not just the patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe just as we kind of not really wrap up, but just another point to think about in this particular episode is what insights can we extract about users? Obviously, we've mentioned privacy, which is obviously critical.
Yep.
And it's important then how that we then use those things to improve the places that we're custodian of. So that data enables us to understand human behavior and then design places that are for those particular individuals. We mentioned about the ICP, the ideal customer profile in that sense. How can data, we've started to touch on this already, I understand. How can data help us understand different user types, that be a commuter, a family, a tourist, a worker in that particular place? And then how we shape the place. We mentioned the market, what day of the week it's on. Understand the different user types.
Yeah, and there's lots of ways. I mean, the sensors nowadays are pretty sophisticated. So just a pure footfall sensor will also be able to identify people by age, by gender. They can re-identify people. So, so if they've seen someone before, they can see them again, or they can hand over. So they might see one sensor might see someone, and another sensor will then recognise that other one's seen it. So you can sort of have this smart stuff going on. A lovely one I love is the buying group, and you talked about kind of families. Now, people, if a family's going into a shop or down the street, say typical nuclear family, mum, dad, couple of kids. Now, realistically, that's one buying unit. Yes. If we treat it as 4 people, we go, well, we've only got one person out of 4 buying. But actually, we know it's one buying unit, and one person's going to buy it. The mum or dad's going to pull the wallet out. It's not going to be the kids, is it? So the cameras can actually do it as well. They can pick up buying groups and look at that. So there's some smart stuff that can be done. They're also able to see. They can look at vehicle types. So cars, trucks, vans, bikes, that sort of stuff. So you understand, from a town centre, who's moving through it and how they're moving through it, who's stopping where and what's going on. And then when you do that overlay of the smart data, you can see where people are coming from. I think that's a really important one. It kind of uses the app in the phone identifies where the phone is residing overnight. And that gives you a kind of postcode block. It's not down to a postcode because, again, for anonymizing the data, we bring it up to a postcode block. But then you can look at overlay of town centre and say, well, where are people actually coming from? They're all coming from this part of town, but not this part of town. Why is that? What's going on there? So you can start to you can understand movement and where things are going. I had an example where we've got a town that's on the border of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And a lot of people are living in Northern Ireland but coming into this town to work. And in fact, about 40% of it. And you can see the patterns. It's really interesting to watch that sort of stuff, where they're all residing and where they're coming to. So all of that stuff helps you sort of understand who's actually in there, where they're coming from, potentially what they're doing. You know that from the brand affinity. You can see where they prefer to go to, what money they've got to spend, what their household composition looks like. So there's so much you can look at and so much you can kind of shape out to say, actually, is this the type of people we want in there? I found a lot of town centres and even like shopping malls, when they're kind of looking to regenerate, they want to look at what's happening now because they can show that progression through to when they've done the work. And that's great for funders who say, look, we've spent a whole lot of money in your town. What can you show us what's going on? You can say, well, look, we've actually changed the population who's in there. More people coming in, and they look like this. So there's a lot you can do to help identify it. But as we said before, there's so many different data points out there. You've got to ask the right question, otherwise you get lost.
Easily, I think. So I guess we're saying then that purely footfall numbers is not enough. Purely a number that 100,000 people went down that street yesterday is not enough. We need to understand that deeper level of information, those behavioural layers, dwell time, flow, seasonal differences, like you said, origin to destination. It's really important we get that deeper level of information.
Yep.
Before we can then start to affect projects, affect decisions. And I guess in some senses, create behavioural change. So around active travel, economic uplift, dwelling, independent retail push, all of those particular aspects. But I thought, don't have to name places and that kind of stuff, but are there any examples that you've seen where data has revealed something unexpected or has actually taken a project in a direction that no one thought was appropriate, but because of data, that was the right thing to do?
Yeah. So there's a shopping centre up in Scotland. I won't name names, but they've recently purchased by a buying group. And the shopping centre manager came to us and said, look, got a concern. Our footfall numbers are dropping. We don't know why. So we had a look at the data. We tried to look and see what's going on. I did the smart data overlay. And what we realised was there's some roadworks that had been set up, which actually were blocking people coming in there. So we could see, prior to the roadworks, there was a lot of people coming from a certain part of town to the shopping centre. they couldn't get there anymore. So they were choosing to go somewhere else, and that was directly impacting the footfall of the shopping centre. Now, luckily, the roadworks have now been completed, and we're seeing that change back again. But it was a huge insight to be able to say, look, actually, we can see exactly the problem you've got and what it is. And it's going to go shortly as well. Hopefully, a lot of those people changed their behaviour and came back again, which is great, because sometimes behaviour becomes a habit, and then you kind of lost them.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was really interesting just to actually see the proof in the data that what this roadworks had done to the footfall for the shopping centre.
Because again, you could assume that, but unless you analysed it and the careful reporting that you're able to do in this particular situation, you wouldn't have the evidence base for it.
Yeah, and there's other ways of measuring it. You could do a survey of all the people that are in the shopping centre, but you're not getting those people that aren't there anymore. So this showed you that kind of both sides of that story.
Brilliant. I mean, there's so many more questions that I've got brewing in my head. Super insightful episode of the podcast, and that's what we do. We get experts from around the place management world to give us a clear insight into their particular area of professionalism and how that impacts place. I always want to make sure that thanks for being part and facilitating this conversation. Really good to have you on the podcast. But I always want to make sure that, just to wrap up the episode, that we have a nugget that we can go away with, a little soundbite that can be really help and direct maybe the decision that we're thinking about, our project that's coming up that we are starting to work on. So what would be that kind of one piece of advice? You've given loads already. One piece of advice that we as a place custodian could be thinking about as we approach that next project or that next thing we're working on.
I mentioned it already, but I'll re-mention it because it's so important. It's understanding your ideal customer profile and seeing are they coming in there. And you can do that very quickly, very simply through smarter data. You don't need to have any infrastructure in place. You can get a report, one-off report, get that done, and you can truly see what your customer profile looks like. And being able to have that discussion with your retailers is going to be so insightful. You can say, here's who's coming into town at the moment. Who would you like to come into town? How can we get those people? Great. And it's going to give you so much stuff to do that you can focus around events on. You can think about your wayfinding, think about how do you attract people, what the marketing process is, but just understand properly who's coming into your town.
Brilliant, love it. And I'm sure, like me, you want to continue this conversation and connect with Mark and his team. So kind of, if we want to find out a bit more about what you guys are involved with, how can we find out more about you guys?
The website is pfm-intelligence.com. It's intelligence with an E. You can always email me, so it's mark.gosnell@pfm-intelligence.com. Or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I tend to put quite a bit of information out there, so there might be some relevant stuff that you can pick up on. But yeah, feel free to reach out. More than happy to have a discussion, be a sounding board, and maybe help you move forward with your plans.
Perfect. Well, it just leaves me to say thank you very, very much for being an excellent guest on the podcast. I've learned an awful lot, and just in this short period of time, and look forward to learning more in the future as well. So thanks for being part of the episode, and look forward to catching you soon.
Sounds good.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Navigate Now. I've been your host, Jon Docksey, and we're looking forward to you joining us on the journey of exploring everything around people and places. If you like this episode, please go on YouTube or on Spotify, click like and subscribe and follow, and help us work together to continue the journey of how we can improve people and the places that we manage.